takes us to a time in our history where there was a lot of movement. So we had people moving from the east out west in search of many things. Some of them were in search of land, some of them were in search of gold and silver, and some of them were in search of just a little more room. At this time out east, there were quite a few people living there, and a lot of people wanted to just make a different way of life for themselves. So to homestead and to have a farm and to have a little bit of more room for their families to grow. So what you see here are some images of some settlers that came through Colorado, came through, of course, Nebraska and all of those states that are to the east of us. And these settlers moved through in wagon trains. And in your learning yesterday with Ms. Campbell, you learned a little bit about what it would be like to ride in a covered wagon or a stagecoach. A stagecoach is actually a wagon that you would pay someone like a taxi to take you out west, and a covered wagon would be more one that you would own on your own, and then you would have it pulled by mostly oxen out west. So these settlers would pack up their wagons. They would bring everything that they owned, of course, things that would fit in the wagon. They would have to make some choices about what they were taking, and they would come out west. And many of them settled in the Poudre River area. We're going to talk about that in a moment. Some of them kept moving on to California. Some settled, some didn't even make it to Colorado, right? And some of them settled before. Noisy truck going by. Okay, so these settlers were people who were coming out to kind of make a new way for themselves. So settlers came into this area, and one thing to think about is that they followed rivers. So we can think about rivers as being kind of the highways of this time. So the Platte River is a river that is close to here, but not as close, of course, as the Poudre River. And these people would follow the rivers and they would come through. Well, at the same time as these settlers were moving through, there was also a bit of an uprising with our Native American community. So at this point in time, our Native peoples were very frustrated, very angry with our American government. And they were frustrated with the way they were being treated, with their land being taken away. And the reason I'm mentioning this now is that these things were happening at the same time. And with the Native American uprising, this created some trouble for the settlers. So these settlers were moving through and they were being attacked. Their wagon trains were being attacked. They were being robbed, meaning the natives would steal things from their wagon trains. And this became a problem. So this became a problem, of course, for the Native people and also became a problem for the settlers. So during this same time, our American government chose to send some soldiers out to this area. So they actually sent over a group of soldiers there was a group of men from Ohio specifically who came to this area to kind of help with this conflict. So they were sent here by the government to help the settlers move through safely and to try to kind of help remedy this conflict and to try to keep the settlers safe as they were moving through. Another thing to mention is this was a very valuable route at this time. So what was happening is some people were traveling and with them, they would be carrying their things, of course, which would be valuable. But there was also a group of people who were traveling back. So traveling back from the gold rush or traveling back from California with gold, with silver, with supplies, and settlers and natives quickly realized that a lot of these wagon trains had very valuable items on them. And so with all of this combined, the American government made the decision to send these soldiers out. So in the early 1860s, we had the established camp of Camp Collins. This was one of our pictures on our inquiry pictures from the beginning of the of this planner, and if you look at this, I can see some foothills in the background. I can see some buildings. I see a flagpole in the middle. And this was a military fort. So you may think of a fort as an area of land that's surrounded by a wall. But in this case, there was no wall. In fact, this fort saw very little military action, meaning there were no wars between the Native Americans and the settlers. But what they were here to do is to just kind of help keep the peace. And they were sent out here to kind of help protect the land and this area and the settlers. So Camp Collins was established in 1862. You may see a familiar word in there, Collins. I think your inquiry brains are probably putting a few things together, which I love, and we'll get there. So Camp Collins, the original location was in LaPorte. So of course, that's another reason why we study this particular military camp, because it was right along the banks of the Poudre River, right here in our beautiful little town of LaPorte. So these soldiers went about their daily lives. They lived together. They ate together. They would have to go up into the hills to collect wood and to collect supplies for themselves. And at the time, they were being led by a general called William Collins. So I'm going to just kind of flip over to this picture of him. So this is Colonel William Collins. You also got to see this picture of him in our original inquiry picture. So those of you that thought that he was some sort of a military general, you are correct. So he was a colonel, and he was leading these men. So he was leading these men in the camp. He was kind of caring for them. He really didn't live in the camp with them, but he was leading them kind of from afar. And in our video, you're going to learn a little bit more about the details of that. So he was the leader of these gentlemen. So I'm going to scoot back just a little bit on my slides here, because there was kind of an event, a kind of a big event that happened to the original Camp Collins. And it was a pretty significant event that happened only 2 years after it had been established. So I want you to just think for a minute. This camp was established right on the banks of the Poudre River. Those of you that frequent the river like I do know that in the spring we have lots of snow melt, and with snow melt comes flooding. And in 1862, I believe it was, yes, we had a flooding event happen in the Poudre River area. So this significant event, like I told you, was not a battle, but it was a flood. And swollen from spring snowmelt in early June 1864, the flood completely destroyed the camp. Many of the soldiers barely escaped with their lives, but they did all escape. Accounts say that all of the soldiers survived, even most of their horses survived, that they were all able to get out quickly, but the camp itself was completely destroyed. So they had to make a decision about recreating the camp and where to do that. So they decided to move the camp a little farther from the river. So they learned, of course, from their first mistake of making their military camp too close to the river's edge, and they decided to move the camp a little bit farther from the original location. So I'm going to read this bit on this slide. It says, after the flood, the commander of the fort wrote to the commander of Fort Laramie in southeast Wyoming, Colonel William O. Collins, and suggested that the site was moved several miles farther down the Poudre, and that would make a better location for the fort. So the new Camp Collins was then moved to what is now Old Town Fort Collins. So I think you're putting together now that, yes, Camp Collins is the very, very early beginnings of our other beautiful town of Fort Collins. So we have Colonel William Collins to thank for the name of our town. It is named after him, although he never lived here. So an interesting fact that I find with this is that Colonel William Collins actually never lived in this area, but he did lead the soldiers that were living here, and he was a great leader. And so our beautiful town here is named after him. So they moved that to, actually, I would love to show you guys a map. Let's see if we can do this. We'll see if it works. If it goes black, don't worry about it. But I forgot to look this up with you, but I want to show you. Okay, So this, of course, is a present day map of Fort Collins, but I'm going to be able to show you on the map where the original fort was. So I'm going to zoom out a little bit here. And of course, you know, if we were in school, this is exactly what we would be doing, right? Okay, so if you look here, this is the square here. Here's the Old Town Library. This is LaPorte Avenue. And then this is this part of Riverside and College that makes this bit of a triangle here. So this right here, and you notice here's our Poudre River. This is where the new Camp Collins or the new fort was built after the flood. So as I zoom out here, and we kind of keep our sights on that little triangle, we can see that that is the very first part of our town. And that is where that original fort, or rather the second fort, was built. And so that kind of helps us have an understanding of why we call it Old Town Fort Collins and why we get our name Fort Collins from Colonel William Collins. So in your video today, you're going to be watching the Camp Collins video on our Old Town Fort Collins Before videos. And you're going to learn a few more details about the settlers moving here, about Colonel William Collins, and kind of what was going on in the military fort at this time. Next week, we are going to learn about a very important person who was actually involved with the camp. And ladies, she is a woman. And we call her the mother of Fort Collins. So we're going to be learning about her next week and her connection to this camp and to the beginning of Fort Collins. Thanks for learning with me today. I love teaching history to you guys.